Welcome back to this Crossroads course. My name is Kyle, and the topic for this lesson is the Mosaic period, the formation of the nation. The Israelites went to Egypt as a small group of 70 relatives. During their 400 years in Egypt, they grew to 3 million people. Because of their great numbers, when a new king came to power in Egypt, he considered them a threat. So he forced them into slavery and treated them harshly. In order to possess the land promised to the patriarchs, they needed to be delivered from slavery and formed into a nation. Israel's deliverance from bondage, formation into a nation, and preparation to possess the promised land is recorded in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These 4 books form one long story, subdivided only because it could not fit on a single scroll. They cover a period of about 50 years, 1450 to 1400 BC. The simplest way to study them is by analyzing Israel's movements. Israel's movements during the Mosaic period. Egypt to Sinai, Exodus 1 to 18. Camp at Sinai, Exodus 19, Numbers 10 verse 10. Wilderness wanderings, Numbers 10 verse 11 and 21 verse 34. Camp at Moab, Numbers 22, Deuteronomy 34. Exodus, the redemption of the nation. The book of Exodus is so named because it describes the departure of Israel from Egypt. Exodus records the redemption of the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt and their establishment as a nation, governed by the terms of God's covenant and the laws of God. The book can be divided into 2 halves, redemption from Egypt, Exodus 1 to 18, and revelation from God, Exodus 19 to 40. Nelson outlines it as follows. Redemption from Egypt, Exodus 1 to 18. The need for redemption, 1. The preparation for redemption, chapter 2 to 4. The redemption of Israel, chapter 5 to 15. The preservation of Israel, chapter 16 to 18. Revelation from God, Exodus 19 to 40. God's revelation of the covenant, chapters 19 to 31. Israel's response to the covenant, chapter 32 to 40. Redemption from Egypt. The Hebrews flourished in Egypt, growing from 70 to 3 million in only 400 years. Out of fear, the Egyptians persecuted them, forcing them into slavery. Their suffering prompted them to cry out to the Lord for deliverance. Although it might seem harsh, their suffering was a necessary part of their preparation for nationhood, for if they had been comfortable in Egypt, they would not have wanted to leave and would not have fulfilled God's plan for them. Suffering is often a means of salvation. When we prosper, we tend to forget God, but when we suffer, we soon remember Him. In response to their pleas, God raised up Moses to deliver them from the Egyptians. Moses, who was to become one of Israel's greatest leaders, was the son of Hebrew parents, but was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. He spent the first 40 years of his life living as an Egyptian prince. Thus he became familiar with the Egyptian laws and ways. Then he killed an Egyptian in an attempt to help a Jewish slave and was forced to flee from Egypt to the desert of Midian. He spent the next 40 years living as a shepherd in the wilderness. When Moses was 80 years old, God appeared to him in the burning bush and commissioned him to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. At first, Moses was reluctant to go, but when God showed him His power and promised to be with him, he finally consented. Egypt was the most powerful nation in the ancient world, and Pharaoh was the most powerful man in the ancient world. Therefore, his response when Moses delivered God's command to let the Israelite slaves go was to be expected. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh. Moses, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go. Exodus 5 verse 1. Pharaoh, who is the Lord that I should obey Him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Exodus 5 verse 2. Two contextual factors help us understand Pharaoh's response. First of all, the pharaohs believed they were gods and they exercised godlike power. Furthermore, in the ancient world, wars were regarded as battles between the gods of the warring nations. The subjection of the Hebrew under the Egyptians suggested that the gods of Egypt were greater than the God of Israel. These factors help us to understand both Pharaoh's reluctance to comply with Moses and the nature and significance of the ensuing conflict between them. The 10 plagues that followed, Exodus 7 to 11, represented a power encounter between the gods of Egypt and the God of Israel. Each plague demonstrated Yahweh's supremacy over one of the Egyptian gods. For example, turning the water into blood, first plague, showed his power over Sotis, the god of Nile. And 3 days of darkness, the 9th plague, showed his power over Ra, the god of the sun. The Egyptian magicians were able to imitate the first plagues, but after the later plagues, even they admitted Yahweh's greater power. F.J. Grieve summarizes the point of the plagues. The 10 plagues God sent had two main purposes. One, to demonstrate God's power over Pharaoh, including his supremacy over the gods of Egypt. And two, to demonstrate his power to Israel. In this way, Yahweh revealed himself to both nations and inspired his people to believe in him. The demonstration of Yahweh's power was so effective that when the Israelites left Egypt, many Egyptians dedicated themselves to the Lord and left with the Israelites. Its effect is described in Exodus 14 verse 31. Exodus 14 verse 31. And when the Israelites saw the great power the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. The final plague was the death of the firstborn son from each family. God told the Israelites to kill a lamb as a substitute for each firstborn son and sprinkle the blood on their doorposts, so that the angel of death would pass over their houses. The death plague finally broke Pharaoh's resolve, and he sent the Israelites away. Thus they were delivered by the power of God. Their redemption from Egypt forever remained the most definitive event in Jewish history and served to establish them as a nation dedicated to the Lord. We should note two other points about the plagues. Firstly, in all the plagues, the Israelites were protected while the Egyptians were afflicted. Secondly, the scriptures tell us that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. The Hebrew reads, God caused his heart to stand firm. Pharaoh had already resolved to resist God, but God strengthened his resolve so that he could display his glorious power. Once the Israelites had left and Pharaoh had mourned for a few days, he once again changed his mind. He sent troops to bring them back, but God opened the Red Sea to allow the Israelites to cross over into Sinai Peninsula. The Egyptians were killed while trying to cross the Red Sea. Thus Israel's deliverance from Egypt was complete. There was no going back. Revelation from God. After the Exodus, the Israelites spent 3 months in the wilderness. During this period, the Lord preserved them from thirst and hunger and chaos. Then they came to Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, the Lord approached Moses to establish a covenant with Israel. Exodus 19 to 24. The kind of covenant Yahweh proposed with Israel was modeled on a sovereign vassal treaty. If Israel accepted God's offer, he would become their sovereign, their God and king, with the responsibility to protect and provide for them. And they would be his servants, with an obligation to serve and obey him. The 3 most important elements of the covenant-making process are evident in Exodus 19 to 24. The blessings it entails for the vassals, chapter 19, verse 3 to 6. The responsibilities it requires of the vassals, chapter 20, verse 1 to 23 and verse 33. The ceremonial confirmation of the covenant, chapter 24, verse 1 to 18. First, the Lord stated in clear terms that he would do for Israel. All the promises of the Abrahamic covenant remained in effect, such as the promise that they would possess the land of Canaan. But the following was added. Exodus 19, verse 3 to 6. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." In essence, the covenant promises has three parts. I will be your God, you will be my people, and I will dwell among you. They would enjoy a special relationship with Yahweh together with all the privileges and responsibilities that such a relationship entailed. Note especially that they were to be a holy nation, set apart for God and his purpose, and a kingdom of priests, a people through whom God would reach out to all nations. Israel was called to exalt God among the nations, not to be exalted above the nations. When the Israelites accepted God's offer of a covenant relationship, he proceeded with the second step, namely what he required of them. The 10 Commandments form the basis of what he required of them. Exodus 20, verse 1 to 17. The 10 Commandments represented a summary of their moral duties toward God and their fellow man. The 10 Commandments: do not worship any other gods. Do not make or worship any idols. Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Keep the Sabbath day holy. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not give false testimony. Do not covet. God expanded the 10 Commandments with other instructions given in the Book of the Covenant, Exodus 21 to 23. The expansion functioned as the laws of civil society, which were based on God's moral laws. The Israelites agreed to Yahweh's terms, and all that remained was to ratify or confirm the covenant. This was done by means of a covenant ratification ceremony in which they offered sacrifices to the Lord. Moses read the book of the covenant to them, and then sprinkled the blood of the covenant on them. This was the ceremonial way of confirming a covenant. With the covenant between Yahweh and Israel confirmed, it was necessary for the Israelites to build a tabernacle to serve as God's dwelling place among them and as their place of worship. Exodus 25, verse 8 to 9. Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. The tabernacle was an elaborate tent built according to God's specifications. Every item of furniture was full of symbolic meaning. Exodus 32 to 40 records the Israelites' response to the covenant. Their first response was disobedience, Exodus 32 to 34. While Moses was on Mount Sinai, receiving the specifications for the tabernacle, they rebelled against Yahweh and made themselves a golden calf. God punished them and threatened to destroy them. But in response to Moses' intercession, he recounted and renewed his covenant with them. Then they responded in obedience, Exodus 35 to 40, by constructing the tabernacle as God commanded Moses. Leviticus, the sanctification of the nation. The Israelites camped at Mount Sinai for a full year. During this time, they were transformed from a disorganized group of slaves into an organized nation. The key to the transformation was the giving of God's law. Law is a misleading translation of Torah because the core meaning of Torah is guidance or instruction. The law of God is instruction for holy living, designed to regulate all of society in a way that promotes godliness in personal, spiritual, and civil matters. The law of God fall into three categories: moral laws, instruction concerning godly living; ceremonial laws, instructions concerning godly worship; and civil laws, instructions concerning godly judgment. Although some of these laws were given in Exodus 20 to 23, most are recorded in Leviticus. Since Leviticus contains so many instructions that relate directly to priestly duties, it was named after the Levites, the priestly tribe. Nelson outlines Leviticus as follows. Laws of acceptable approach to God. Sacrifice, chapter 1, verse 1 to 17 and 16. The laws of acceptable approach to God. The laws of priests. The laws of Israel regarding purity. The laws of national atonement. Laws of acceptable walk with God. Sanctification, chapter 18, verse 1 to 27 and 34. The laws of sanctification for the people. The laws of sanctification for the priesthood. The laws of sanctification in worship. The laws of sanctification in the land of Canaan. And the law of sanctification through vows. Whereas Exodus focused on the initial act of redemption, Leviticus deals with the lifelong process of sanctification, making holy. The word holy occurs 74 times in Leviticus. In addition, the moral command to be holy, because I am holy, occurs 5 times. Leviticus 19 verse 2. Therefore, be holy, because the Lord your God is holy. Geisler suggests an alternative outline of Leviticus based on the statement, be holy, because I am holy. Chapter 1 to 10 deals with the statement, I am holy. He labels them the way the Holy One because they describe the judicial way to approach a holy God, namely through sacrifice and meditation. These point to Christ, who is our atoning sacrifice and our high priestly mediator. Chapters 11 to 27 deal with the statement, you shall be holy. They define the moral and civil responsibilities of a holy people. The central message of the book is that privilege carries responsibility. Israel had the privilege of being Yahweh's chosen people, but that brought them the responsibility of being holy, because Yahweh was holy. If they lived holy lives as God instructed them, they would model for their surrounding nations the blessings of living in covenant relationship with the Lord and obeying His commands. Numbers, the guidance of the nation. Once God had established His covenant with Israel and given them His laws, it was time to prepare them as a nation for the mission to which God had called them, the conquest of the Promised Land. The account of their preparation to enter and conquer the Promised Land is recorded in the books of Numbers. Nelson outlines the structure of Numbers clearly. The preparation of the old generation to inherit the Promised Land. Chapter 1, verse 1 to 10. The failure of the old generation to inherit the Promised Land. Chapter 10, verse 11 to 25 and 18. The preparation of the new generation to inherit the Promised Land. Chapter 26. The story begins with the counting and organizing of the people to possess the land. Numbers takes its name from the census conducted in chapters 1 to 4. After Moses had counted and organized the tribes, he gave various instructions for the consecration of the nation to Yahweh, Numbers 5 to 10. This was an essential part of their preparation for conquest, because they could only conquer if Yahweh gave them the victory, and He would only give them the victory if they were devoted to Him. See Joshua 3 verse 5. Then the Israelites, at God's command, set out from Mount Sinai to go and possess the land of Canaan. When they were near the Promised Land, the Lord told Moses to send 12 leaders, one from each tribe, to spy out the land. They reported that the Promised Land was prosperous, but 10 of the 12 spies brought back a negative report saying, we cannot defeat the powerful nations living there. When they heard this, the people rebelled against the Lord and against Moses, refusing to enter the land. But Caleb and Joshua insisted that the Lord would give them victory. Numbers 14 verse 7 to 9. They said to the entire Israelite assembly, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey. and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will swallow them up. This protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." In spite of their positive report, the Israelites did not believe. The Lord was so angry. The wilderness period was characterized by two main things: Yahweh's miraculous and gracious provision for his people, and their repeated rebellion against him and his servant Moses. The Lord supernaturally provided his people with food and water while they were in the wilderness, but they were never content with his provision. They constantly grumbled against the Lord and against Moses, saying they would have been better off staying in Egypt. Instead of accepting that their wilderness wanderings were the result of their own sins, they blamed God and Moses. On more than one occasion, God punished them severely for their rebellion. Had it not been for Moses' intercession, he might have destroyed them completely, but their hearts were so hardened that they refused to accept responsibility. When the old generation had passed away, and the period of wandering in the wilderness was completed, God again instructed Moses to take a census. Numbers 26. The time had come to resume the original plan to possess the promised land. The disorganized Israelites were reorganized in preparation for the new generation to possess the land. At this time, the Lord gave instructions to ensure fair division of the promised land among the tribes and families of Israel. Once again, the Lord gave them consecration instructions concerning sacrifice, feasts, and vows. Numbers 28 to 30. They then began the conquest of the land east of the Jordan River. This land was shared between three tribes: Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. The other tribes would have to wait until they crossed the Jordan to receive their land. A momentous event occurred just before the conquest of the land east of the Jordan. God informed Moses that he would not be allowed to lead the Israelites into the promised land because of an act of disobedience. Therefore, Moses publicly commissioned Joshua as his successor. Although Moses continued to lead Israel until his death, his public commissioning of Joshua was an essential step in preparing the people to receive Joshua as God's chosen leader when Moses died. Deuteronomy, the instruction of the nation. Numbers ends with the old age generation having passed away and the new generation about to enter the promised land. They were camped east of the Jordan, and Moses was about to hand over the leadership of the nation to Joshua. Deuteronomy records Moses' final appeal to the Israelites before he handed over to Joshua and they entered the promised land. The book is instructed as 3 sermons that represent Moses' final act of preparing and commissioning the Israelites for the God-given mission that awaited them. Moses' sermon in Deuteronomy. Sermon 1, what God has done for Israel. Sermon 2, what God expects from Israel. And Sermon 3, what God will do for Israel. Geisler suggests the following outline: the review of Israel's wanderings, chapter 1 to 4, the restatement of God's law, chapter 5 to 26, and the revelation of Israel's future, chapter 27 to 34. Moses' first message is a review of the most important events in Israel's history from the time they left Mount Sinai until they arrived at their camp east of the Jordan. He draws attention to the following events: the appointment of leaders to share the burden of counseling, the sending out of spies to explore the promised land, the rebellion of the Israelites by refusing to possess the land, the punishment of the Israelites in the form of wilderness and wanderings, the conquest and distribution of some land east of the Jordan, the appointment of Joshua as Moses' successor. Why the long historical review? Simple. History is instructive. If we do not learn from the past, we are destined to repeat its mistakes. Any group of people with a sense of destiny must have a sense of history. They must know not simply the facts of their past, but specifically know God has worked in their history. From God's past works, they will learn what their God is like, what He will do for them, and what He expects of them. There were two main lessons Moses wanted them to learn from their history. The first was the value of obeying God. Chapter 4, verse 1 to 14. When they obeyed God, they prospered, and when they disobeyed, they suffered. The second was the nature of God. Chapter 4, verse 15 to 40. Yahweh is unlike any other God. They were never to pervert their relationship with Him by worshipping other gods or making idols. Moses' second sermon, which forms the main body of the book, is a long commentary on the law of God, how God expects the Israelites to live when they enter the promised land. He begins by restating the 10 commandments. Then he takes each commandment in turn and expands it by examining different aspects of it. The key verses of the book are found in chapter 11. Deuteronomy 11, verse 26 to 28. See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am giving you today. The curse if you disobey the commandments of the Lord your God and turn from the way that I commanded you today by following other gods, which you have not known. These verses give the motivation for all God's laws. Since God designed us, He alone knows what is best for us. His instructions for life are designed to prosper us, to protect us, and to provide for us. When we walk in His ways, the result is blessing. But when we reject His ways and follow our own desires, we bring a curse upon ourselves. Because the Lord loves us, He gave us instructions for living blessed lives. Moses' third sermon consisted of a renewal of the Sinaitic covenant with the new generation that was to possess the land. He laid out before them the blessings that would come upon them if they kept the covenant and the curses that would come upon them if they broke it. He warned them that if they possessed the promised land, they were faithful to God's covenant. They would prosper in everything they did, but if they were unfaithful, they would be punished and would be driven out of the promised land. The book closes with Moses' last 3 acts as Israel's leader: transferring leadership to Joshua, pronouncing a blessing on Israel, and dying on Mount Nebo. How could Moses have written Deuteronomy if the book includes the account of his death? Moses wrote almost all of the Pentateuch, but a later compiler collected his notes and added a few editorial comments. Joshua probably added the account of Moses' death at the end of Deuteronomy. Summary. During the Mosaic period, God delivered the Israelites from slavery in Egypt and established a covenant with them at Mount Sinai. He transformed them from a disorganized group of slaves into an organized nation ready to possess the promised land. The key to their development into a nation was the grieving of the law of God. However, the first generation did not obey God's command to possess the promised land, so the nation was forced to wander in the wilderness until that generation died. Then God prepared the new generation to enter and possess the promised land.